I've had a lifelong fascination with transportation, especially the railroads, but also the steamship business, the airline business, the motor carrier business, even barge business. And I've worked in most of those areas somewhere in the course of my life. So I majored in transportation at the University of Tennessee, got out the spring of 1960, and much to my surprise, I was going to be in the Army through the ROTC program and expected to go right into the Army, but turned out they didn't want me for a year. So I went out and got a job in the operating department of the Louisville National Railroad and was a locomotive engineer and fireman between Mobile and New Orleans for a year on the railroad that went to sea. The railroad that went to sea is generally thought about as the railroad that went to Key West, Florida, but the railroad between Mobile and New Orleans has places where the only lights you see at night are the stars and the fishing boats at sea. After that, I went into the Army in the Transportation Corps, wound up running a ammunition railroad and trucking situation in an ammunition dump in France during the Berlin crisis. Came back, intended to go back to the railroad, but Eastman wrote me a letter saying they were looking for people for the transportation area of their company and they'd be interested in talking to me. So I had no intention of going to Eastman, but my father told me that I owed it to them to go down and speak to them just as a courtesy, which I did. Some of the best advice my father ever gave me. I turned out working for Eastman for 36 years and among other things wound up as a logistics manager for Texas Eastman Company, which is the sister to Tennessee Eastman Company in Longview, Texas. And part of the job there was we had a railroad that was in my responsibility. We had 26 miles of track, 1,600 railroad cars, and 5 locomotives. So I guess you could say I played trains through most of my life and on a one-to-one scale, and people paid me to do it. So I left Eastman in 1998, so I'm a veteran retiree and have had a great time in the last 17 years doing other things, but am still very closely related to the railroad business. And at present time, I'm the chairman of Rail Solution, which is an advocacy group for higher speed rail service. In 1932, a fellow named W.W. Way, Bill Way, made his thesis at the University of North Carolina, The History of the Clinchfield Railroad. And that book was kind of a economic Bible for me as I grew up. Long out of print, hard to find, but I managed to get a copy. And Bill Way, Dr. Way, went on to found the transportation school at the University of Tennessee in the Business College, which is now called the Logistics Department and is one of the major parts of the University of Tennessee Business School and a very well acknowledged specialty field in the economic world. So I planned to study under Dr. Way, and when I went to UT, it turned out he had died in the spring before I went into fall. So I never knew the man, but he had an inordinate influence on my life. In the 1850s, the railroad was being projected from Lynchburg, Virginia to Chattanooga, actually being projected from both ends. And there was a great competition in East Tennessee between the small towns in East Tennessee, which was Rogersville and Kingsport, 2 words, and Goodson, which became Bristol later, Jonesboro. All those communities wanted the railroad. And the good citizens of Jonesboro in the 1850s prevailed on Kingsport to let them have the railroad, and they would in turn support dredging the Holston River for navigation on the Tennessee River and the Holston River. So in 1859, the railroad from Lynchburg came to Bristol, Goodson, Bristol, and the railroad from Chattanooga was built north to Bristol, and it came through Greenville, Johnson City, Jonesboro, Piney Flats, and so Kingsport lost the opportunity for the East-West Railroad, and the folks in Jonesboro and other areas obtained that, and they never dredged the river. So Kingsport withered on the vine for the next 30 or 40 years. In 1902, a gentleman named George L. Carter. George L. Carter was a native of Carroll County, Virginia, which is where Hillsville is. He made his initial money on land speculation on zinc and copper and iron ore deposits in what they call the Cripple Creek area of Southwest Virginia, and also in the coal fields of Southwest Virginia. But in 1902, he devised a plan to build the railroad that the Three Seas had failed to complete. And in the course of 3 years, he bought up most of the pieces of the Three Seas Railroad and renamed it the South and Western Railway. And George L. Carter had many of the characteristics of Howard Hughes. He was a very reticent fellow, avoided publicity to a fault, left almost no records of his own because he had a philosophy which was called a burn buck settlement. If he sold a business, he would get together with the principals to buy the business, and they would agree that he would convey the minute books and whatever financial papers were essential, and they'd burn the rest of the records, and they'd burn them right there in the meeting room where they solved the conveyance of the property. So that's the kind of fellow that he was and continued to be his whole life. But in 1905, he had run out of his own resources to work on the railroad. And at the same time he run out of his own resources, he had acquired or had options on several 100,000 acres of coal and timberland in Southwest Virginia and Eastern Kentucky. He went to New York in a very uncharacteristic way, found an investment banking company called Blair and Company to examine his project and see what they would be willing to do. Blair and Company was a private banking company, just as Chase Morgan or Lehman Brothers or so many of the other big banks in New York now. That Baring Brothers was a private corporation, and it had the support in its business was the leading people in the financial world in the early 20th century. Thomas Fortune Ryan, for example, was one of the principals. He was involved with U.S. Steel. He owned Consolidated Edison Electric Company in Chicago. He was one of probably the wealthiest 25 people in the country. Some of the other principals were a fellow named Isaac T. Mann, who was one of the wealthiest coal operators in the Appalachian area, who lived in Bramwell, West Virginia, which was an area they called Millionaires Row in 1905, which was perhaps the same thing as Billionaires Row now in the Central California area or Washington State. Another person that was in the original group, or came shortly after the original group, was W.M. Ritter. W.M. Ritter was the largest hardwood lumber manufacturer in the United States. His company eventually became Georgia Pacific. There were a number of other people, including James A. Blair, and then to link to Kingsport, John B. Dennis was one of the principals in Blair and Company, as was his brother, Ray Dennis. Over time, John B. Dennis became the overseer of the project that involved Kingsport, the coal fields of Southwest Virginia, George L. Carter, and so forth. So in 1905, the winter of 1905, George L. Carter got these people with Blair and Company to come to East Tennessee, Southwest Virginia, and look at the properties that he had assembled and evaluate the project and hopefully finance it. And they did. And there's a very interesting photograph which is widely circulated of these 10 or 12 people on horseback arrayed in a circle with a coal mine in the background as they were examining the territory. So between 1905 In 1915, these gentlemen built the Carolina, Clinchfield, and Ohio Railway. That was a successor to the South and Western Railway. Across the mountains, 277 miles from Elkhorn City, Kentucky, which is on a tributary of the Ohio River, to Spartanburg, South Carolina. And of course, the railroad was not the end itself. The end itself was they had these hundreds of thousands of acres of coal lands in Virginia and Kentucky that had no value because they didn't have any way to move it. And with the construction of the railroad, then they suddenly had a product that was in great demand as the Industrial Revolution of the textile business in the Carolinas, the furniture business in the Carolinas, home heating, steamship fuel through Charleston and Savannah, railroad locomotive fuel, which was a big business in 1910, 1915, and right on up to after World War II. All those were markets for Clinchfield Coal, and Clinchfield Coal Company was owned by Blair and Company, as was the Carolina, Clinchfield, and Ohio Railway. The CC&O Railway, when it was finished, was the most expensive railroad ever built in the United States on a mile-for-mile basis in constant dollars. And the reason for that was that they hired a fellow named M.J. Caples, who was an engineer by trade, civil engineer and a mining engineer, and he designed a low-grade railroad in a high-grade environment across the Appalachian Mountains. And the railroad ran across the mountains instead of down the valleys between the mountains. And as a result, they dug 55 tunnels. 3.5% of the total mileage was underground in these tunnels, one of which was 1.5 miles long, and the shortest one was right here at the entrance to Kingsport, 150 feet. And they built these huge steel viaducts over the valleys to jump from one mountainside to another mountainside. And there's Kingsport is bracketed by two of those bridges. There's one at Rotherwood, and there's one just beyond Eastman at on John B. Dennis. Also at Boone's Creek near Johnson City, at Copper Creek over in Southwest Virginia. Those are just four that are right here close by. In any event, they built this low-grade, high-capacity railroad across the mountains and finished it in 1915. One of the other things that Carter had done is in 1902, under the guise of some conventions that were being held in the area, he managed to buy the land between the Rotherwood Mansion and where Holston Ordnance is in Hawkins County to Chestnut Ridge, which is basically the valley where the core of Kingsport is, including Eastman, downtown Kingsport, the hospital, Sevier Terrace, the Rotherwood Farm, the Ridge Fields, the whole valley here for something like 50 cents an acre. And that was folded into this railroad project when these gentlemen from New York came and financed the project. Well, so here they have these coal lands, this coal mines, this vast amount of timber that's scattered over the mountains of Southwest Virginia, which Mr. Ritter proceeded to convert to lumber. And they're developing a market for coal, but they are also owning this land in Kingsport, and they own large tracts around Irwin. They owned a good bit of property in Johnson City. So they began a industrial development project so that they could sell coal. And in Kingsport, still Kingsport, two words, in 1910, they financed and built Clinchfield Portland Cement Company. And that was an interesting project for two reasons. One is they financed it and attracted them here, and the raw materials were in Spears Ferry, Virginia, and coal for the plant came from the coal lands. But two is the railroad was still under construction at the time, and they became the first big customer for cement to line all those tunnels, those miles and miles of tunnels with concrete. So that was the first project. They then built and financed Kingsport Brick Company, which eventually became General Shale Corporation, which was headquartered eventually in Johnson City, but is a very viable company to this day, although they're no longer in Kingsport. Those are the first two industries. They then attracted a leather company, Grant Leather Company, and a company that made wood pulp. And the wood pulp company evolved into Mead Corporation, which through a number of hands is now Domtar, which is the most, it's the state-of-the-art paper mill in the United States, and probably the last paper mill that will be built in the United States, because the computer age has put a lot of pressure on paper sales and manufacturing. But the railroad sponsored the folks who eventually became Mead Corporation. They also brought George Eastman here in 1920 and sold him on properties that were partially built as a part of the World War I military effort, and we'll come back to that in a minute. They attracted Corning Glass for a glass manufacturing facility, which is now Heritage Glass, but has been AFG, ACG, Blue Ridge Glass, a number of other companies. And the last major industry that they attracted was Borden Mills. And Borden Mills was a textile company out of Massachusetts. And they came here in 1925 and built half of what they intended to build, the Borden Mills, which was the biggest single manufacturing structure in Kingsport. It was located across from Eastman, just off Eastman Road, and the plan was to build the building they built and then build a second one right beside it, which never happened because the Depression came along. But two things happened. First, in 1923, Blair and Company, which was, the chairman was James A. Blair, they decided not to sell the company or merge the company. They decided to dissolve the company. And so James Blair bought an island in the Caribbean, and he proceeded to liquidate his holdings, as did all the other principals, except that the railroad was not easy to liquidate because it was governed by the Interstate Commerce Commission and regulated, and a lot of governmental red tape. So what they did is they put the railroad out in hopes that somebody would buy it. But the governmental regulators didn't think well of selling the Clinchfield Railroad. So they proceeded to lease the Clinchfield Railroad to the Atlantic Coastline and the Louisville and Nashville Railroad for not 99 years, but for 999 years at the rate of 3% of the stock value for the first 5 years, 4% of the stock value for the next 5 years, and then 5% of the stock value for the remaining 989 years, all to be paid in gold. Now bear in mind, this was before the gold standard was abolished by Franklin Roosevelt. So, I mean, that seemed like an ironclad situation. Well, the railroad was leased to the ACL and L&N effective January 1st, 1925. And they began paying the 3% and then the 4%, and then of course the 4% became an issue in 1930, right in the middle of the Depression, and the 5% became a big issue in 1935, and the railroad, Clinchfield, was not earning the money to pay the rent, but the two of them came up with the rent and paid it, and eventually it turned out to be just a regular financial gold mine for them. But the thing that happened in 1925, which no one anticipated, is that the industrial development of Kingsport, as far as new companies are concerned, ceased. The railroad people had been sponsoring this, financing this, encouraging this, and after 1925, no major industry came to Kingsport except Holston Ordnance Works, which is now called BAE, which is the largest conventional explosives plant in the world. In 1917, the U.S. government came to Kingsport, and the railroad had a hand in attracting them, and began building what they called Edgewood Arsenal, was the property where the new Eastman Executive Office Building and the old office building are now. That was Edgewood Arsenal. And parallel to that, because the Germans were already at war in 1914 with everybody in Europe, and we were going to get there, in 1914 and 15, the Federal Dye Works was established in Kingsport, which is built in some of the areas where Kingsport, where Eastman actually is now. But that came about because they couldn't get dyes from Europe because of the war, and so both of those plants were partially constructed when the railroad, when the United States got into World War I, the Great War, but were never finished. The Federal Dye Works actually was in production, but was never finished. Now, Edgewood Arsenal, in a little known factor, dealt with poison gas shells, which is not something we talk about now. But anyway, the Germans, in effect, created those two industries, and as a result, Eastman wound up buying what was left of those two industries in 1920. So there's where Eastman, or where the Germans were our sponsor in World War I. And in World War II, in the first 6 months of 1942, the Germans, and of course that was the first 6 months we were in the World War II, the Germans sank 436 ships in the Gulf and the Atlantic Ocean off of the Carolinas and the New Jersey coast for several reasons. The main reason being that we didn't really have an adequate defense, but a second reason was that that the depth charges that the United States and the British were using would not crack the hulls of the German submarines. And the British had developed a new explosive called RDX. That's the American designation. But they couldn't make enough of it for two reasons. One is they couldn't make it in a continuous fashion. They kept blowing up their plant. And two is they couldn't make enough of it to matter. So they brought the formula to the United States and asked the War Department if they would build a manufacturing plant for RDX. And unbeknownst to Eastman, RDX had a very important component of acetic anhydride. And acetic anhydride is very dry, and it will suck water out of about anything else that it's in contact with that's not hazardous itself. And when you get water in acetic anhydride, you get acetic acid, which is vinegar. But RDX required acetic anhydride, and Eastman was one of the major producers of acetic anhydride in the United States. So they bring this material, this dilute material out of the British process to Eastman and say, can you folks clean this up? Well, they didn't tell them it was adulterated with a high explosive. They just said it needed to be cleaned up. And Eastman in 1942 devised a process for doing that. And as a result, the War Department came to Eastman and said, how about building a plant to make RDX, which Eastman agreed to do reluctantly. And then they asked them to double the plant. So in the 1943-44 era, there were like 15,000 construction people in Kingsport building Holston Ordnance Works, which is now BAE. The government, while Eastman was doubling Holston Ordnance, the government also came to Eastman and said, we have this project down at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, that we want you to help us build. And so, much to Eastman's surprise, they wound up building, they were one of the three contractors who built Oak Ridge and the atomic bomb facilities there. So it was amazing what talent could be drawn from Eastman over a very short period of time, like 4 years, to build, the world's largest conventional explosive plant, and then to build the first nuclear facilities the world had ever seen. But the industries that Kingsport attracted through these Blair and Company principles had two really interesting concepts. we hear or used to hear, not so much anymore, we used to hear this term about vertical integration. You know, somebody would build automobiles, they would go back and they'd build a steel mill like Henry Ford, and then they'd build something else that hoses for cars, and they'd build rubber manufacture. Eventually they'd have a car and they'd made all these pieces. Well, Kingsport was built on two vertical integrations. Bear in mind, in 1917, there were probably less than 2,000 people in the Holston Valley around Kingsport. So what do you need to build a town? Well, you need lumber. Eastman was basically a lumber company for its first 10 years, started in 1920. So here was a lumber mill. What do you need? Brick, Kingsport Brick Company. What do you need? Cement, Clinchfield Portland Cement. How about glass? There's Blue Ridge Glass. So here you've got basically the building blocks for a city in a construction sense. But there was a parallel silo. One of the other industries that I haven't mentioned to now was Kingsport Press Company. Kingsport Press was built in the early 20s. It started off going to be a harness manufacturing facility that in World War I, which never got finished for two reasons. One, horses weren't that popular anymore, and two is the war ended quickly. So anyway, the Blair and Company people managed to get the Kingsport Press established. And so here is a company, here is a vertical integration where you've got Mead Corporation that's making paper. They ship the paper across the street to Kingsport Press, who prints books. Next to Kingsport Press is Holliston Mills, which makes the glue to hold bookbinding materials for a book. Out on the edge of town is Borden Mills, which makes bookbinding cloth, which they ship over to Kingsport Press and Holliston Mills. And out at Eastman is the company that makes the chemicals that go into the bookbinding book. So here you've got a vertical integration of that style of industries, and it's a surprising thing to a lot of people. But at one time, Kingsport had the highest postal receipts in the state of Tennessee, and the reason for that was that Kingsport Press printed the Book of the Month Club, and they were all shipped in the mail to the people who were Book of the Month people, and they shipped books out of here in freight car quantities every day. The interesting thing about the period between Eastman coming and World War II, though, is that in 1930 or 31, Eastman began making the first plastic, synthetic plastic, which was called cellulose acetate, which comes from wood. And as a result, the introduction of cellulose acetate, which is what safety film was made out of. Before that, you had nitrate film, and nitrate was highly flammable, and a lot of things burned down as a result of using nitrate film. Safety film, cellulose acetate, solved that problem. But Eastman also discovered you could make fiber out of it. You could spin it into thread and so forth. And so cellulose acetate became the first major plastic in the country. Steering wheels, knobs on your car, those were all cellulose acetates. Toothbrushes were a big thing that were made from cellulose acetate. But as a result of all that, in the 30s, Eastman expanded steadily. And so Kingsport itself never really experienced a depression like just about everywhere else did, just because Eastman was ramping up and expanding. And then of course World War II, we've already talked about how big they were impacted there. So the advantage that Kingsport's got is Kingsport is one of the lowest cost of living places in the United States. And that is structurally provable by any economic indicators you want to use. We live very economically. The tax rates are relatively low, the cost of living is low, power is low, the moderate temperature and climate, makes it easier to live through our 4 seasons of the year. So we got a great advantage there. We have another great advantage is this is a wonderful part of the world. The Smoky Mountains are over here on one side, the Cumberland's on the other. We got lots of water with the Holston River, great economic advantage to us and to the area, lots of recreation opportunities. Having lived coast to coast, border to border, and overseas, I'm here to tell you that Kingsport is the place to be.